So, in 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And so, essentially this was kind of like a revolutionary topic, because what Darwin did was he connected a series of like unrelated observations and a lot of like connections that no one had ever really seen before, differences, similarities. And so there are two major points in this book. And the first one is essentially evolution, saying that many species like are they share common ancestors and they've developed according to like their environment. And the second one is natural selection, meaning that a population can change over time if the individuals possess certain traits that allow them to live better in their environments. And so he really didn't use the word evolution, he more used the word evolutionary adaptation. And so what it is, it's in certain populations inheriting certain traits to allow them to live better and to reproduce in certain environments.
Okay, so the first section is about how Darwin challenged the views that the Earth was it wasn't as young as people were saying it was, and that it was a lot older. So Aristotle suggested that species were unchanging, and he recognized that there were certain affinities among organisms. So he developed a scale called the Scala Naturae, which is a ladder that life forms can be arranged on to show increasing complexity. In contrast to the Scala Naturae, Carl Linnaeus developed a binomial format for naming species that is still used today. And so that's kind of like the kingdom phylum way that we do it now. So like for humans, like our name would be Homo sapien. So it's the two-part naming system. Linnaeus also adopted a nested classification system that groups similar species into increasingly general categories. So it's kind of what I talked about before. Similar species are in the same genus, then the same family, and so on down the classification. Okay, so Darwin used fossils to develop his theory about evolution and adaptation. So does anyone not know what a fossil is? Okay, so everyone knows it's just life form that's been like preserved in rocks. So fossils were usually found at after mud settled onto the bottom of lakes and seas and swamps. Yes,
Yeah,
Scott?
really, by definition, a fossil is any evidence of a past living organism. That could even be a rocky replica, that could even be a footprint, an impression of a leaf, it doesn't matter. If it's evidence of a past living life form, by definition, that would be a fossil.
So new layers of sediment covered over the old ones, and they compressed them into superimposed layer of rock called strata. So that's kind of like what you see in like this picture. There's like different layers upon layers of like rock and mud that form, and then you can use those layers to identify like what time periods different species and organisms lived in, because the further down in the strata you go, the older the organism is. So paleontology is the study of fossils, and what I kind of just said, the older the strata, the more dissimilar the current life forms that organism or evidence of that organism was. So one of the things that was observed while studying paleontology was that from one layer to the next, new species seemed to appear in the strata while others seemed to disappear. And at the beginning of paleontology, scientists debated if changes occurred because of catastrophic events or if changes occurred gradually. So Darwin concluded that if continuous change occurred, the Earth would be much older than the expected age. He then reasoned that similar slow and subtle processes could produce biological change. However, he was not the first one to apply this idea of gradual change. So Lamreich formed two principles that were widely accepted at the time. And this was the concept of use and disuse first, which is the idea that body parts that are used extensively become larger and stronger, while those that are not used start to deteriorate. So can anyone give like an example of sort of a body part in an animal that you think has deteriorated? Tony?
Well, whales have like hips and I think femurs, and they're really, really tiny because they haven't used them in over thousands of years.
Sam, did you have one too?
Tailbone or blue?
Yeah. The second idea that, John?
Appendix?
Yeah. that's-
The appendix is still used though. You can certainly live without it, but it is part of the endolymphatic system.
Yeah, John.
But yeah, the other two, they like haven't been used, so they started to deteriorate. So like the whale, it's like pelvis and femur, they're much smaller because obviously it doesn't use it. The second idea was inheritance of acquired characteristics. And this is the idea that an organism can pass down these modifications to its offspring. So for an example, the like long neck of a giraffe, it was used over time to like keep stretching up and trying to get leaves, so that made it get longer, and then one organism was able to pass down those traits to its offspring. Lambrick also thought that evolution occurred because organisms had an inherent drive to become more complex. Darwin, however, disagreed with that concept, but he did think that generations played an important role in how species change over time. Okay, so in the 19th century, it was thought that species remained unchanged since their creation. However, there was some doubt about this concept. So as Darwin started to begin his research, he got on a boat, and his mission was to chart unknown areas of South American coastline. So while on this voyage, Darwin spent most of his time on land collecting and studying animals and plants. So what he started to notice in South America was that all the organisms that he saw were well suited to the environments that they were found in. And he found fossils that were clearly different than the living species he was seeing, but those fossils still distinctly resemble the organisms that were living at the time. So one of the areas that Darwin was most fascinated with was the Galapagos Islands. And he was really intrigued by these because they're a cluster of islands all close together, but each one tends to have slightly different organisms that are all part of the same species and family. So one of the first things he observed were mockingbirds, and they all seem to be very similar, but he also noticed that they were also slightly different. And he noticed that the birds tended to change from island to island, or that the birds would be similar on a few islands, and then further away from that one island you got, the bird tended to change. You'll notice that many of the species on the island were completely different than those that were seen on the South american shore. So this made him hypothesize that the Galapagos had been colonized by organisms that had strayed from South America and then diversified once on the island. And this is what gave rise to new species on each of the islands. So adaptations are inherited characteristics of organisms that enhance their survival and reproduction in specific environments. Darwin later noticed that changes in the environment tended to correspond to adaptations in organisms. And it started him asking one central question, which was, could a new species arise from an ancestral form by gradual accumulation of adaptations to a different environment? Okay. So one of his most famous studies is about the Galapagos finches. And can anyone kind of tell me what that research was all about? Sam?
It looked like the finches had different beaks, and then you noticed that different